The bullet shattered the window of the town hall just as Zelda Owens stood to address the assembled citizens of Oro Blanco, Arizona. And in that moment of chaos and flying glass, she realized her life would never be the same. It was the spring of 1882, and the mining town nestled in the Santa Cruz Valley had grown prosperous enough to attract opportunists and outlaws in equal measure. Zelda had come to the meeting to speak against the corrupt land agent who was forcing families from their homesteads, but before she could utter a single word of protest, violence had erupted. "Get down!" A man's voice cut through the screaming as strong hands pulled her beneath the wooden benches. The shooting continued for another few seconds before silence fell like a heavy blanket over the room. Zelda found herself pressed against the floor, staring into the concerned eyes of a stranger whose dusty hat had fallen beside them. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, a weathered face that spoke of long days under the Arizona sun, and an expression of genuine worry that seemed directed entirely at her. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. His hands were still on her shoulders, steadying her even though the immediate danger had passed. "No, I'm fine," Zelda managed, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "What happened?" "Someone fired from outside, probably meant to scare folks." He helped her sit up carefully, checking the room with experienced eyes before deeming it safe enough to move. "Name's Harrison Kane. I'm new in town, just hired on as deputy." Sheriff Morrison was already organizing men to search for the shooter, his gruff voice barking orders while women and children were ushered toward the back exit. Zelda watched the chaos with growing anger rather than fear. This was exactly what she had expected. The land agent, Marcus Drummond, had made threats before. He did not like anyone questioning his authority or his methods, and Zelda had been gathering evidence of his illegal dealings for weeks. "Miss Owens," Mayor Fletcher hurried over, his round face red with exertion and anxiety. "You should go home. This meeting is clearly too dangerous to continue." "That's exactly what they want," Zelda said, getting to her feet and brushing splinters of wood from her blue calico dress. "They want to silence anyone who speaks against corruption. If we run now, they win." The mayor looked uncomfortable. He was a decent enough man, but weak when it came to confrontation. "Now, Zelda, I know you mean well, but perhaps this isn't the time for a woman to be involving herself in such matters. These are dangerous men we're dealing with." Harrison Kane stepped forward, and Zelda noticed how his jaw tightened at the mayor's words. "With respect, sir, seems to me that's all the more reason folks need to hear what she has to say. Cowards who shoot through windows are counting on fear keeping people quiet." Several men who had been gathering near the door paused, listening. Zelda felt a rush of gratitude toward this stranger who had defended not just her safety but her right to speak. It was rare enough for a man to pull a woman from danger, but rarer still for one to suggest she had something worth saying afterward. "The meeting is postponed," Mayor Fletcher announced firmly, clearly unwilling to debate the matter further. "We'll reconvene when tempers have cooled and the sheriff has made arrests." Zelda wanted to argue, but Harrison touched her elbow gently. "Let me walk you home," he said quietly. "We can talk on the way." The afternoon sun hit them full force as they stepped out of the town hall onto the dusty Main Street. Oro Blanco was busy as always, with freight wagons rumbling past and miners heading toward the saloons after their shifts. The town had sprung up almost overnight when silver was discovered in the nearby hills 5 years earlier, and it still had that raw, unfinished quality of a place built more on hope than planning. "You don't have to escort me," Zelda said as they began walking. "I've lived here most of my life. I know these streets. I'm sure you do, Harrison replied, matching his pace to hers, but I'd feel better seeing you home safe. Besides, I meant what I said in there. I want to hear what you were planning to tell everyone. Zelda studied him as they walked, trying to gauge his sincerity. She had learned to be wary of men who seemed too helpful. Often they had their own agendas. But something in Harrison's straightforward manner suggested honest interest rather than manipulation. Marcus Drummond, the land agent, has been falsifying documents, she began, deciding to trust him. He claims certain homesteads were never properly filed, then resells them to buyers back east for substantial profit. The families who built those homes and worked that land for years suddenly find themselves evicted with nowhere to go. That's a serious accusation, Harrison said, though his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. You have proof? I've been copying records from the land office when his clerk steps out for lunch. The original filings are all legitimate and properly dated. But Drummond has been creating false documents that show different dates and signatures. I've compared them, and the forgeries are obvious if you know what to look for. They turned onto a quieter residential street lined with modest houses and small gardens. Zelda's home was a simple wooden structure that had belonged to her parents. Her father had been a blacksmith, respected in the community, but he had died of fever 2 years ago. Her mother had passed when Zelda was just a child. At 22, Zelda lived alone and supported herself by teaching at the small schoolhouse and taking in sewing work. Miss Owens, what you're describing could get you killed, Harrison said as they reached her front gate. Drummond has connections. Money buys a lot of protection and a lot of silence. So I should say nothing. Let him destroy more families. Zelda's voice rose with frustration. Everyone tells me to keep quiet, to let the men handle it, but the men aren't handling it. They're either scared or paid off, or they think it's not their concern. Harrison removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. He had a habit of tilting his head slightly when he was thinking, Zelda noticed. I'm not saying you should keep quiet. I'm saying you need allies. And you need to be smart about how you fight this. Are you offering to be an ally, Deputy Kane? Zelda asked, suspicious again. You've been in town, what, a few days? Why would you risk crossing Drummond for a woman you just met? Because I've seen this before, Harrison said simply. In Colorado, in New Mexico. Men like Drummond use the chaos of growing towns to line their pockets. They count on people being too busy surviving to notice they're being robbed. And they especially count on dismissing women's concerns because society makes it easy to do so. He met her eyes directly. My mother was a widow who lost her ranch to men exactly like him. She tried to speak up and nobody listened. I was 15 and couldn't help her. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to stop that kind of theft, I would. Zelda felt something shift in her chest. This was not pity or condescension. This was understanding born of shared experience. What happened to your mother? She survived, but barely. We moved to Denver where she has a boarding house now. She's doing well, but she never got justice for what was taken from her. Harrison replaced his hat. I became a lawman because I got tired of watching powerful men abuse people who couldn't fight back. The sheriff works for Drummond, Zelda said flatly. Everyone knows it. That's why nothing has been done. Sheriff Morrison hired me without consulting Drummond, Harrison said with a slight smile. The old deputy quit suddenly, and Morrison needed someone fast. I don't think he realized I actually intend to do the job properly. That gives us a small window of opportunity. Us. Zelda repeated, hope kindling despite her caution. If you'll trust me with those documents you've copied, I can start building a case. I can also contact the territorial marshal in Tucson. This goes beyond local law. Harrison's expression turned serious. But I need you to be careful. No more public confrontations until we have everything in order. Can you do that?" Zelda wanted to argue that she would not be silenced or pushed aside, but she also recognized practical wisdom when she heard it. "I can be patient if it means actually stopping him. The documents are inside." "Wait here." She hurried into her house and retrieved the carefully wrapped bundle of papers she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. When she returned to the porch, Harrison was scanning the street with the alertness of a man accustomed to trouble. She handed him the bundle and their fingers brushed briefly. The contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. "I'll keep these safe," he promised. "And Miss Owens, what you've done, gathering this evidence that took real courage, don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After Harrison left, Zelda stood on her porch watching his tall figure walk back toward the center of town. She felt simultaneously relieved and anxious. For months, she had carried this burden alone, knowing what Drummond was doing but unable to make anyone listen. Now she had an ally, but could she truly trust him? Time would tell. The next few days passed with agonizing slowness. Zelda went about her normal routine, teaching her students their letters and arithmetic, mending torn shirts for the miners' wives, buying supplies at the general store. But beneath the mundane surface, she watched and waited. Harrison came by twice, always with a legitimate reason, once to ask about schoolhouse security after a recent break-in at the Mercantile, once to return a book he claimed to have borrowed from her father years ago, though Zelda suspected it was simply an excuse to update her. "I've sent a telegram to the marshal," he told her quietly while pretending to examine her garden fence. "I've also been asking questions around town carefully. 3 families willing to testify about losing their land. That's a start." "Drummond will hear that you're investigating," Zelda warned. "He has eyes everywhere. Let him hear. I'm a deputy doing my job, nothing suspicious about that." Harrison straightened, speaking in a normal voice again. "Your gate hinge is loose. I can fix that for you tomorrow if you'd like." "That would be kind of you," Zelda said, playing along with the pretense. But Drummond did more than hear. On Friday evening, Zelda was closing her shutters against the cooling desert air when she noticed a man watching her house from across the street. He made no effort to hide his presence, just stood there smoking a cigarette, his posture radiating menace. She recognized him as one of Drummond's hired men, a gunslinger from Texas with a reputation for violence. Zelda's hands trembled as she fastened the shutters and checked that her door was securely barred. She had her father's old pistol, but she had never fired it at anything but tin cans. The night seemed to stretch forever as she lay in bed, starting at every sound. Sleep came in fitful bursts filled with anxious dreams. The next morning the watcher was gone, but a dead crow had been nailed to her front door. The message was unmistakable. Zelda stared at the poor bird, anger warring with fear. She was removing it when Harrison came around the corner, saw what she was doing, and broke into a run. "When did this happen?" he demanded, his face dark with fury. "Sometime during the night. There was a man watching the house yesterday evening. I should have sent for you, but I did not want to seem hysterical." Zelda's voice was steadier than she felt. Harrison gently took the crow from her and set it aside. "You're not hysterical. This is intimidation, plain and simple. Pack a bag. You're not staying here alone." "I won't be driven from my home," Zelda protested, though the thought of another night like the last one made her stomach churn. "It's not about being driven out. It's about being smart." Harrison's voice softened. "Mrs. Chen at the boarding house has a room. You'll be surrounded by people there, much safer. This is temporary, just until we have Drummond arrested." Zelda wanted to refuse on principle, but practicality won out. She packed enough clothes for a week and locked up her house, hoping it would still be standing when she returned. The boarding house was a large, rambling structure near the edge of town, run by a Chinese widow whose husband had worked the mines until a cave-in took his life. Mrs. Chen asked no questions, simply showed Zelda to a clean room with a window overlooking the street and promised her 3 meals a day. That evening, Harrison stopped by to check on her. They sat in the boarding house parlor, maintaining a proper distance, but Zelda was intensely aware of his presence. He had removed his gun belt as a courtesy to Mrs. Chen's rules, and without the trappings of his office he looked younger, less guarded. "The marshal is coming next week," he said quietly. "I got a telegram today. He's interested in the case, especially since there have been similar complaints about Drummond from other counties." "A week," Zelda repeated. "What happens between now and then? We keep our heads down and gather any additional evidence we can." Harrison leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I know this isn't easy. You wanted to confront him publicly, to make him answer for what he has done. But this way is more likely to actually work." "You keep defending my right to speak," Zelda said, studying his face. "Why is that so important to you? Most men I know believe women should concern themselves with domestic matters and leave business to men." Harrison was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "My mother used to say that truth does not care about the gender of who speaks it. She was right, but the world did not want to hear her anyway. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. About how much knowledge and wisdom gets dismissed just because it comes from someone society has decided does not matter." He met her eyes. "You saw what Drummond was doing when men who should have noticed were either blind or complicit. Your voice deserves to be heard loud and clear, Miss Owens. Not as a favor, but as a right." The words struck something deep in Zelda's heart. She had spent so long fighting to be taken seriously that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply believe her without argument or condescension. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me as more than just a problem to be managed. I see you as someone brave enough to stand against injustice when it would have been easier to look away," Harrison said. "That's admirable regardless of whether you're wearing a dress or trousers." They talked until Mrs. Chen gently reminded them of her house rules about propriety. Harrison left with obvious reluctance, and Zelda climbed the stairs to her room feeling something she had not experienced in a long time: hope mixed with an unfamiliar flutter of attraction. Harrison Kane was unlike any man she had known. He listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, and treated her as an equal partner in their mission rather than a damsel requiring rescue. The following days established a pattern. Harrison would stop by the boarding house each evening after his patrol, ostensibly to update Zelda on the investigation, but really, she suspected, to ensure she was safe. They would sit in the parlor and talk, their conversations ranging from strategy to personal history to hopes for the future. Zelda learned that Harrison was 26, that he loved horses and hated dishonesty, that he had learned to read from his mother who had been a teacher before marrying his father. She always said education was the great equalizer, Harrison told her one evening. That it did not matter if you were rich or poor, man or woman. If you could read and think critically, you had power. "I tell my students the same thing," Zelda said, smiling, "especially the girls. I want them to know they can be more than wives and mothers if they choose, though there is honor in those roles too." "You never married," Harrison observed, then looked embarrassed. "I apologize, that was too personal." "It's all right," Zelda assured him. "I came close once." A mining engineer who seemed kind and respectful. But when he proposed, he made it clear he expected me to give up teaching and any activities outside the home. He wanted a decorative wife, not a partner. I refused him. "His loss," Harrison said with such conviction that Zelda felt warmth spread through her chest. "What about you?" she ventured. "Surely there's been someone." "A few somethings that never quite became anything," Harrison admitted. "Most women wanted a man with safer, more profitable work." "Can't say I blame them. Being a lawman's wife is not easy." He paused, then added quietly, "And I've been waiting to meet someone who understood why this work matters to me. Someone who cared about justice as much as I do." Their eyes met and held. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility. Zelda's heart raced, but before either could speak, Mrs. Chen appeared to announce she was closing the parlor for the night. On Tuesday, everything accelerated. Zelda was walking back from the schoolhouse in the afternoon when she saw smoke rising from the direction of her house. She picked up her skirts and ran, arriving to find flames consuming her front porch while neighbors formed a bucket brigade from the nearest well. Harrison was already there, shouting orders and helping to organize the effort. By the time they got the fire under control, half her house was destroyed. "This was deliberate," Sheriff Morrison said, examining the charred remains. "Someone poured lamp oil on the porch and lit it." He looked at Zelda with something that might have been sympathy. "You've made yourself some powerful enemies, young lady. Maybe it's time to reconsider your accusations." "My accusations are documented facts," Zelda said, her voice shaking with rage and grief as she stared at what remained of her childhood home. "And this fire proves that Drummond is desperate. Innocent men do not resort to arson and intimidation." "You can't prove Drummond had anything to do with this," Morrison said, though he would not quite meet her eyes. "Yet," Harrison interjected. "We can't prove it yet, but Marshal Garrett arrives tomorrow and I suspect he'll be very interested in this fire." Morrison's face reddened. "You went over my head to the territorial marshal. That's insubordination, Kane." "That's doing my job when my superior officer refuses to," Harrison shot back. "Miss Owens has been threatened, harassed, and now her property has been destroyed. If you won't investigate, someone has to." The two men faced off in the street, tension crackling between them. Finally, Morrison spat in the dust and stalked away, muttering about young hotheads who did not understand how things worked. Harrison turned to Zelda, his expression softening immediately. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I should have posted someone to watch the house. You couldn't have known they'd go this far." Zelda felt numb as she looked at the blackened timbers. Everything her father had built, all her mother's things that she had treasured gone. "I have nothing now. Just what I brought to the boarding house." "You have your life, and you have the truth, and you have people who believe you," Harrison said firmly. He reached out and took her hand, not caring who saw. "And you have me. I promise you, Zelda, we will make this right." It was the first time he had used her given name. Hearing it in his voice, rough with emotion, made something break open inside her. Tears she had been holding back spilled over, and then Harrison's arms were around her, pulling her close against his chest. She felt his hand stroking her hair, heard him murmuring reassurances. For a moment she let herself be held, drawing strength from his solid presence. When she finally pulled back, several neighbors were watching with expressions ranging from approval to scandal. Let them gossip, Zelda thought. She was too tired to care about propriety. "I need to see what can be salvaged," she said, wiping her eyes. They spent the next hour sifting through the wreckage. Most of her belongings were destroyed, but Harrison managed to rescue a photograph of her parents, miraculously intact in a metal frame, and her mother's wedding ring, which had been in a small box in her bedroom. Zelda clutched these treasures as they walked back to the boarding house in the gathering dusk. Marshal Garrett arrived the next morning on the stage from Tucson. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Harrison had arranged for them all to meet at the boarding house rather than the sheriff's office, not trusting Morrison to stay silent about their plans. Mrs. Chen provided tea and privacy in her private sitting room. "Deputy Kane has briefed me on the situation," Garrett said after introductions were made. He looked at Zelda with respect rather than dismissal. "Miss Owens, I've reviewed the documents you gathered. They're compelling evidence of fraud. Combined with the testimonies Deputy Kane has collected and the recent attacks on your person and property, I believe we have sufficient cause to arrest Marcus Drummond and conduct a thorough investigation of his business dealings." Relief flooded through Zelda. "When?" "Today. I've already sent for additional deputies from Tucson. They should arrive within the hour. We'll take Drummond into custody at his office and seize all his records." Garrett's expression hardened. "I won't lie to you, men like Drummond often have layers of protection. Lawyers, political connections, money for bribes. But the territorial government is cracking down on land fraud. The days of stealing from settlers with impunity are ending." "What about Sheriff Morrison?" Harrison asked. "He'll warn Drummond the moment he sees federal deputies in town." "Which is why you're going to keep him occupied, Deputy Kane. I need you to bring him a complaint about a disturbance on the east side of town. Keep him busy investigating nothing while we work." Garrett smiled slightly. "Can you do that?" "It would be my pleasure, sir," Harrison said. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Harrison left to lure Morrison away on a false errand. Garrett's additional deputies arrived quietly and positioned themselves around Drummond's office. Zelda waited at the boarding house, pacing the parlor floor while Mrs. Chen tried to interest her in lunch. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, Harrison returned with news. "We have him," he said, unable to suppress a grin. "Drummond and 3 of his associates, all in custody. The marshal found enough incriminating documents to fill a trunk. Forged deeds, falsified surveys, records of payoffs to various officials." His expression sobered. "Morrison's name was in those records. He's been arrested too." Zelda sank into a chair, relief making her lightheaded. "It's really over. The arrests are just the beginning. There'll be a trial and you'll need to testify, but yes, the immediate danger is over." Harrison knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. "You did this, Zelda. Your courage, your refusal to stay silent even when everyone told you to, that's what brought him down." "We did this," she corrected. "I could never have succeeded alone. You believed me when no one else would. You gave me the support I needed to see it through." They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped, eyes locked. The connection between them had been building for days, and now it seemed to reach a breaking point. Harrison lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, his gaze never leaving her face. "Zelda, I know this might not be the right time, but I need to say something." His voice was low, intense. "These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your conviction, I've come to care for you deeply. More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances. But watching you fight for what's right, listening to your ideas, your passion for justice and education, and making the world better, I've fallen in love with you." Zelda's breath caught. She had felt the attraction growing between them, but hearing him speak the words aloud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Harrison, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "You've been through trauma, and I don't want you to feel pressured. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that when I said your voice deserves to be heard, I meant in every aspect of life. As my equal, my partner, if you'll have me. Harrison Kane, you are unlike any man I've ever known," Zelda said, her voice thick with emotion. "You see me not as a problem or a curiosity or something to be managed, but as a person with value and capability. You've stood beside me when everyone else wanted me to sit down and be quiet. You've given me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. You've taken me seriously." She reached out to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her fingertips. "I've fallen in love with you too. How could I not?" Harrison's face transformed with joy. He stood, pulling her up with him, and then his arms were around her and his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as weeks of restrained longing found release. Zelda wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing close, feeling his heart racing against hers. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I want to marry you," Harrison said. "I want to build a life with you here in Oro Blanco. I want to support your teaching and whatever else you choose to do. I want to be the man who stands beside you while you change the world." "Yes," Zelda said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes to all of it, Mrs." Chen chose that moment to enter with tea, took one look at them standing in an embrace, and smiled knowingly. "I bring cake too," she announced. "For celebration, yes." The trial took place 6 weeks later in Tucson, where Drummond's influence was less pervasive. Zelda testified for nearly a full day, presenting the evidence she had gathered and explaining in detail how Drummond's scheme had worked. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her, suggesting she was motivated by hysteria or romantic attachment to Deputy Kane, but Marshal Garrett had prepared her well. She remained calm and factual, her testimony unshakable. Harrison testified as well, as did the families who had lost their homes. The prosecution presented the incriminating documents found in Drummond's office, and an expert testified that the forgeries Zelda had identified were indeed fraudulent. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Drummond was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison, and his co-conspirators received similar sentences. The news reached Oro Blanco by telegram, and the town erupted in celebration. Families who had been dispossessed would have their lands restored. Others who had been living in fear of Drummond's machinations felt free for the first time in years. And Zelda, who had been shamed and silenced for daring to speak truth to power, was hailed as a hero. The wedding took place in late summer, 3 months after Drummond's arrest. By then, Zelda's house had been rebuilt larger than before, with a spacious parlor and a study where she could work. The whole town contributed labor and materials, their way of apologizing for not believing her sooner and thanking her for her courage. Harrison had been promoted to sheriff after Morrison's removal, and he used his new authority to implement reforms and hire deputies who would actually serve the community rather than corrupt interests. They were married in the small church on a blazing August afternoon, with half of Oro Blanco in attendance. Zelda wore her mother's wedding ring and a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen and several other women had sewn together. Harrison wore his best suit, his dark eyes never leaving his bride as she walked down the aisle. There was no one to give her away, she gave herself, as was fitting for a woman who had always chosen her own path. "I promise to honor your voice and your choices," Harrison said during the vows he had written himself. "To stand beside you as an equal partner in all things, to encourage your dreams and support your endeavors, to love you not despite your strength but because of it." Zelda felt tears slide down her cheeks as she made her own promises. "I promise to trust you with my truth and my vulnerability, to build a life with you based on mutual respect and shared purpose, to be your partner in bringing justice and compassion to this community we both love." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers. Harrison kissed her thoroughly, and Zelda felt a joy so complete it seemed impossible that just a few months ago she had been alone and afraid, fighting a battle everyone insisted she could not win. The reception was held in the town square, with tables of food and a small band playing fiddle music. They danced until sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, until the stars emerged in the vast Arizona darkness. Zelda had never imagined she could be this happy. Not just because she had found love, though that was precious beyond measure, but because she had found someone who understood that her voice mattered, that her ideas and opinions and observations about the world had value, that she was complete as she was, not something requiring taming or softening or changing. Their first year of marriage was busy and fulfilling. Harrison took his duties as sheriff seriously, working to build trust between the law and the community. He hired a former Tohono O'odham scout as a deputy, breaking with tradition in a way that raised eyebrows, but improved relations with the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands surrounded the town. Zelda continued teaching, and with Harrison's encouragement, she also began writing articles about land reform and justice for a newspaper in Tucson. Her words reached audiences far beyond Oro Blanco, influencing territorial policy and giving voice to others who had been silenced. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, talking about the day's events, making plans for the future, simply enjoying each other's presence. Harrison would rest his hand on Zelda's knee while she read aloud from a book, or she would lean against his shoulder while he told stories about his mother's boarding house in Denver. They were small moments of domesticity, but precious for all that. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked one evening as they watched the sunset. "Speaking up when you did, fighting Drummond even though it cost you your house and nearly your life?" "Never," Zelda said without hesitation. "Even if things had turned out differently, even if we had not won, I would still have had to try." Silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of death. I would rather risk everything speaking truth than live safely with a lie. Harrison pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's one of the 1,000 reasons I love you." In the spring of 1884, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mix of joy and apprehension. She wanted children, wanted to raise them with Harrison's values of justice and compassion, but she also worried about losing herself in motherhood the way so many women did. When she confessed these fears to her husband, he took her hands and looked into her eyes with complete seriousness. "You will always be Zelda," he promised. "Wife, mother, and whatever else you choose to be, we'll figure it out together. I'll be there for feedings and changing diapers and everything else. This child will be our shared responsibility, not just yours." And he kept that promise. When their son was born in October, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin, Harrison proved as devoted a father as he was a husband. He would walk the floor with baby Henry at night when the infant fussed, would change diapers without complaint, would sing lullabies in his rumbling voice while Zelda caught a few precious hours of sleep. They made decisions about Henry's care together, discussing everything from feeding schedules to discipline approaches, treating parenting as the partnership Harrison had promised. Zelda returned to teaching when Henry was 3 months old, bringing him to the schoolhouse where he would sleep in a basket while she conducted lessons. The older girls delighted in helping care for him during recess, and Zelda used the opportunity to teach them about infant care and child development. She wanted them to understand that being a mother was a skill that could be learned, not some mystical feminine instinct, and that men were as capable of nurturing as women if they chose to be. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, Zelda and Harrison's lives settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. They raised their son with stories about standing up for what was right, about using your voice even when people try to silence you, about treating all people with dignity regardless of their station. They built a life based on mutual respect and shared values, modeling for Henry the kind of partnership they hoped he would seek in his own adulthood. When Henry was 3, Zelda gave birth to twin girls, Alice and Grace, delivered in their own bedroom with Harrison holding her hand through the long night. The girls were as different as sunrise and sunset, Alice bold and adventurous, Grace thoughtful and gentle, but both inherited their parents' sense of justice. The Kane household was often chaotic with 3 small children, but it was also filled with laughter and learning and love. Zelda continued her writing, now focusing on women's education and political participation. Her articles arguing for women's suffrage were published throughout the territory and even in some Eastern newspapers. She received both praise and condemnation, but she had learned long ago not to let criticism silence her. Harrison supported her work wholeheartedly, often caring for the children in the evenings while she wrote, reading her drafts and offering thoughtful feedback. "You're changing minds," he told her after one particularly well-received essay. "Making people think about things they've always taken for granted. That's powerful." "We're changing minds," she corrected, as she always did. "Your example as a husband and father who treats his wife as an equal, that's just as powerful as anything I write. People see how we live, and it makes them question their own assumptions." In 1889, when Henry was 5 and the twins were 2, Zelda received an invitation to speak at a conference in San Francisco about land reform and women's political participation. It would mean being away from home for 2 weeks, the longest separation she and Harrison had experienced since their marriage. She hesitated, torn between opportunity and obligation. "Go," Harrison urged. "I can manage the children and your mother-in-law is coming to visit anyway." He smiled. "The world needs to hear what you have to say, Zelda. Never forget that your voice matters." So she went, delivering speeches to packed halls, meeting other women who were fighting for change in their own communities, building networks of activism and support. When she returned to Oro Blanco, Harrison and the children met her at the stage station, Henry waving frantically, and the twins toddling forward with squeals of delight. Harrison kissed her in full view of everyone, not caring about scandal, his pride in her accomplishments clear on his face. "You were magnificent," he said, having read newspaper accounts of her speeches. "I'm in awe of you." "And I'm grateful for you," Zelda replied, embracing her children. "For believing in me, for supporting me, for being the partner I always needed but never thought I'd find." As the years passed, their love deepened and matured. They faced challenges, droughts that tested the community's resilience, illness that struck their children with frightening suddenness, but thankfully lifted, political battles over progressive reforms they championed together. Through it all, they remained united, a team bound not just by affection but by shared values and mutual respect. Henry grew into a young man who would eventually study law, determined to fight injustice through the legal system. The twins developed their own distinct paths. Alice became a physician, one of the first women doctors in Arizona, while Grace followed her mother into teaching and activism. All 3 Kane children inherited their parents' conviction that silence in the face of wrongdoing was unacceptable, that every voice mattered regardless of who spoke it. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Harrison and Zelda sat on their porch as they had done countless times before, watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in spectacular colors. The children were grown, or nearly so, the house quieter than it had been in years. But the connection between them was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having weathered 2 decades of life together. "You remember the day we met?" Harrison asked, taking her hand. "That bullet through the town hall window, how could I forget? You pulled me to the floor and then proceeded to change my entire life." Zelda smiled, squeezing his fingers. "I was so angry that day. Angry that no one would listen, that my concerns were dismissed because I was a woman, that Drummond seemed untouchable. And then you met a stubborn deputy who refused to let injustice stand," Harrison said with a grin. "Match made in chaos." "Match made in partnership," Zelda corrected. "You gave me something I had never experienced before, a man who believed my voice deserved to be heard loud and clear, who saw speaking truth to power not as shrewishness or hysteria but as courage. That changed everything." Harrison turned to face her fully, his expression serious now. "You changed everything, Zelda, not just for yourself but for this whole town, for our children, for everyone who saw what you accomplished and realized they could stand up to. You spoke when you were supposed to be silent, and you changed the world." "We changed it together," Zelda said, as she always did. "Your support, your belief in equality, your willingness to be different from other men of your time, that made all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, two people who had found in each other not just love but true partnership. Their story would be told in Oro Blanco for generations, the woman who refused to be silenced, and the cowboy who believed her voice deserved to be heard. Together they had built a life based on justice, respect, and the radical notion that all voices mattered equally. Years later, when Zelda was in her 70s and Harrison's hair had gone silver, they would sit in that same spot and watch their grandchildren play in the yard. The world had changed dramatically since that spring day in 1882, when a bullet shattered a window and brought them together. Women could vote now, could own property in their own names, could speak in public without shame. The changes were far from complete. There was still injustice, still inequality, still voices that needed amplifying. But progress had been made, and Zelda and Harrison had been part of making it happen. "I love you," Harrison would say as he said every day. "My fierce, brilliant, unstoppable wife." "I love you," Zelda would reply, as she always did, "my partner in every sense of the word." And sitting there together, hands clasped and hearts intertwined, they would watch the sunset paint the sky with color and know that they had lived a life of purpose and passion. They had fought for justice, raised children who would continue that fight, and proven that true partnership required nothing more and nothing less than seeing each other as fully human, fully valuable, fully worthy of being heard. The story of Zelda Owens and Harrison Kane became legend in Arizona territory, and beyond a testament to what could be accomplished when voices refused to be silenced, and when people had the courage to listen. Theirs was a love story, yes, but more than that. It was a story about the power of speaking truth, the importance of being heard, and the beautiful possibility that emerges when two people meet as equals and build something extraordinary together. In the end, that was their greatest legacy, not just the reforms they championed or the injustices they corrected, but the example they set of what partnership could look like, of what happened when a woman refused to be shamed for speaking her mind and a man said, without qualification or condescension, "Your voice deserves to be heard loud and clear." From that foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose, they built a love that lasted a lifetime and inspired generations to come.